Welcome to Mount Herzl. We're here today in Israel, in Jerusalem, at the very top of Herzl Boulevard. Behind me, we have the entrance to Mount Herzl. Let's get started. Mount Herzl has a second name, the Mountain of Remembrance. But what are we remembering? Mount Herzl is here to tell the story of our national history. The mountain is split up into multiple sections. At the very top, we have Theodore Herzl, visionary of the State of Israel and father of modern political Zionism. Near him, we have Herzl's family and presidents of the Zionist movement. As we take a step forward, we enter the national leaders section. Prime ministers, presidents, and heads of the Knesset who continued Herzl's legacy and led the nation under the Zionist ideal are buried there. Nearby, we enter the military cemetery. These soldiers sacrificed their lives so that the state for the Jewish people in Israel can exist from the establishment to today. At the bottom of the mountain, we have Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Memorial Museum, which recalls the lowest, most painful, and tragic moments in our history, where we could not protect ourselves. The state of Israel that we have today enables us to defend and protect ourselves. As we make our way up the mountain from Yad Vashem to Theodore Herzl, we take a walk through our history, from destruction to the establishment of the State of Israel. Mount Herzl tells the story of our shared past, but our story is not just about the past, but also about the future. Where did we come from? What were the hardships that we faced? What are the values that our country is built on? It is through understanding these questions and remembering our past that we can continue to build a better future. In 1949, Herzl was buried on this mountain, opening up the mountain as the National Memorial Cemetery. Here, at the National Leaders section, there are 3 leaders who are able to be buried on the mountain: prime ministers, presidents, and speakers of the Knesset. While each of these leaders have the opportunity to be buried on the mountain, almost half of them have chosen to be buried elsewhere. However, some of the people that are buried on the mountain might sound familiar. Golda Meir, who was the first woman prime minister of Israel and the 3rd woman in the world to hold such a position, Yitzhak Rabin, the 5th prime minister of Israel, and Shimon Peres, former prime minister and president of Israel. These leaders have dedicated their lives to the Zionist cause. Theodore Herzl is the man widely considered the father of modern political Zionism. Theodore Herzl was born in Budapest in 1860 and died in Vienna in 1904. One of the major turning points in Herzl's life was in Paris in 1895 at the trial of Alfred Dreyfus. Alfred Dreyfus was a Jewish officer in the French army who was accused of treason. And at the same time, Theodore Herzl was a journalist for the largest newspaper in Europe called the Neue Freie Presse, and he was a correspondent stationed in Paris. And as a correspondent, he went to go cover the trial. And when he got there, he saw something astonishing. The mobs of people outside were shouting death to the Jews. Death to the Jews? It's a trial for one man, Alfred Dreyfus. They should be shouting death to Dreyfus or death to the traitor, but instead they were shouting death to the Jews. Now, Herzl had experienced anti-Semitism in his life before, but he had never seen it on such a scale. So Herzl decides that he had to do something. So he goes back to his hotel, sits down at his desk, and starts writing a book called The Jewish State. In this book, he outlines and proposes a safe haven for the Jewish people where they can get away from the anti-Semitism that was so prominent in Europe at the time. This book was the very beginning of Herzl's Zionist endeavors, and he went on to organize the World Zionist Organization and many congresses and trips with leaders around the world. Herzl dedicated his life to the Zionist cause, and while he died before the establishment of the state, his legacy still lives on today. Shortly before Herzl passed away, he requested in his will to be buried in the future Jewish state. However, when Herzl passed away in 1904, that was not a possibility, and he was buried in Vienna. In 1949, just a year after the establishment of the State of Israel, and a few months after the end of the War of Independence, David Ben-Gurion, who was the first Prime Minister of Israel, decided to take Herzl and rebury him on this very mountain in Jerusalem. Today, it might seem clear to us why Herzl was buried in Jerusalem. However, at the time, it wasn't so clear, and there were other options that were taken into consideration. There were three possible cities: Tel Aviv, Haifa, and Herzliya. Tel Aviv was named after Herzl's second book, Alt Neuland, a novel about Herzl's vision for the future state for the Jews. The second city considered for Herzl's reburial was Herzliya. Herzliya is named after Herzl himself. How fitting! And lastly, Haifa. Haifa was mentioned in Herzl's second book, Alt Neuland, as an ideal burial place for the main character, David Litwack, who many historians say that it was actually Herzl himself. So why was Herzl ultimately buried in Jerusalem? In 1949, most of Jerusalem was under Jordanian rule. Only the western part of Jerusalem was in Jewish hands. David Ben-Gurion wanted to make it clear that Jerusalem was the indisputable capital of Israel. Herzl was buried here in Jerusalem on the tallest mountain, which would later become Mount Herzl. In 1949, Mount Herzl opened. However, it was not originally intended to become the National Military Cemetery. But after the War of Independence, the fallen soldiers were buried on Mount Herzl, officially opening it up as the Mountain of Remembrance.
I'm standing here next to Herzl's grave. As we know, Herzl was reburied in Jerusalem. But how did the second funeral look? There were two factors at play. On the one hand, Herzl requested a simple funeral. But on the other hand, the entire country wanted to pay their respects to the man who contributed so much to the establishment of the state. The procession started at a synagogue in Vienna, and from there, Herzl's remains were flown to the Lod airport, which we now know as the Ben-Gurion Airport. Herzl's coffin was met by David Ben-Gurion and other dignitaries at the airport. The procession then followed a route that took it to all the places Herzl visited on his only trip to the land of Israel in 1898. After that, the coffin was brought to Tel Aviv, where thousands came to say their final goodbye to Herzl. Then the coffin was brought to Jerusalem, to the buildings of the organizations that Herzl himself helped start. Herzl's coffin was brought to its final burial here on this mountain. There were 6,000 people in attendance at the funeral in Jerusalem. As we know, Herzl requested to be buried in the land of Israel, but didn't specify where. To fulfill his wish, 300 representatives from 300 communities and kibbutzim around the country were given bags to fill with dirt, earth, and sand from the places that they lived. These bags were then put in the grave with Herzl, and this way Herzl was really buried with all of the land of Israel. All in all, over 200,000 people took part in Herzl's burial, showing us the incredible legacy that he left behind. When we look at the grave, we can see a small, simple black headstone with just 4 letters, Herzl. There is no need to have anything else written on it. Everyone knew who Herzl was and the Zionist ideals that he stood for. Herzl is buried alone on this mountain. Just like in much of his life and his Zionist journey, he worked alone, so too, with his burial, he's alone. From the spot where he's buried at the top of the mountain, we could see a panoramic view of Jerusalem. Herzl himself didn't get to see the growth and building of Jerusalem, but he knew the potential that the city had. The once small city has now grown to this beautiful view that we can see from Herzl's grave. His dream and wish became a reality.
Welcome to the family section. In 1949, Herzl was reburied here on Mount Herzl, along with his parents and his older sister. Herzl's children and grandson were later buried here as well. Herzl grew up in a loving and supportive family. Herzl and his sister Paulina were best friends, and his parents, Jacob and Jeanette, stood by Herzl's side throughout his Zionist endeavors. When Herzl was just a child, his mother believed he would change history, and she was right. Even when most people thought Herzl and his Zionist ideas were crazy, his parents stood by his side. His father, Jacob, was even the first person to donate to the movement. At the age of 29, Herzl married Julie Naschauer, and together they had 3 children, Paulina, named after Herzl's sister, Hans, and Trudy. In the family section, there is another family buried here as well, Herzl's successors in the World Zionist Organization. On my right, we have Herzl's biological family, and on my left, Herzl's Zionist family, including David Wolfson and Nachum Sokolov. Both families supported Herzl, and while there are no direct descendants in the Herzl family, the Zionist leaders continue Herzl's legacy.
Right now, we are next to the grave of David Wolfson. Wolfson was the second president of the World Zionist Organization, and he left behind two important legacies. The first of these legacies is our flag, which flies over Israel today. Wolfson designed the flag for the Zionist movement, and we can see in it the Jewish elements that inspired him. We have the blue, the tchelet, that we recognize from the talit, and the Star of David, that is the ancient Jewish symbol and a source of pride for Jews around the world. The second legacy that Wolfson left with us is the shekel. Wolfson established the Zionist shekel as the currency for the World Zionist Organization to be used for membership. Wolfson suggested the use of the name of the ancient coin from the Bible. So the next time you see the flag or the shekel, you can remember Wolfson and his contributions. Over here, we have the grave of Nachum Sokolov. Sokolov was the fifth president of the World Zionist Organization. One of the major things that Sokolov did was that he translated Herzl's second book, Als Neuland, The Old New Land. Als Neuland was Herzl's utopian novel for what the state could be, that combines the old and the new. When Sokolov translated this book to Hebrew, he gave it the title Tel Aviv. Tel Aviv is essentially a translation of Als Neuland. Tel is a hilltop made up of many ancient layers, which signifies the old, and Aviv is the season of spring, which signifies the new. The modern city of Tel Aviv is named after Herzl's book. We have just spent some time learning about Herzl as the visionary of the state and all he did for the future state of Israel. We have seen the legacy that he created and learned about the history of the mountain, and through that, the history of the state itself. This is just the beginning of the story of our state. We can't wait to see you here in person. We'd love to continue the conversation, and if anyone has any comments or questions, we will continue the discussion now.